Good afternoon from London, and welcome to the latest in our series of Denton's Brexit and Beyond webinars. My name is Adam Brown, and I work in our energy practice here in London. Joining me today is Roger Matthews, who has recently joined us as a partner in our international trade and regulatory practice, and who formerly worked in the European Commission. Also, Jessica Pattinson, the head of our UK immigration practice. And remotely, we have three colleagues from outside the UK. We have Gordon Giffin, a former US ambassador to Canada and leader of our global public policy group. Paul Lalonde, partner in our Toronto office, a recognised trade law expert and veteran of the NAFTA negotiations. And Nadia Nichai, a partner in our Brussels office, specialising in trade and regulatory matters, including WTO disputes. So we have about an hour for today's session. And we're very grateful to you for all dialing in, since there are other Brexit things that you could be watching at the moment, including an emergency debate in the UK Parliament. We'll come back to that. We're going to begin with a brief reminder of why so much about Brexit is still rather uncertain, even today, just a week before the UK is scheduled to leave the EU. Then we're going to spend most of the session looking more towards the future, and particularly towards the trade negotiations, which, assuming Brexit does go ahead in some form, are going to form an important part of the next couple of years. What can we expect from the trade negotiations that the UK will have to conclude with the EU and other countries? How will Brexit play in a world where the rules-based international order is arguably under somewhat greater stress than it's been for several decades? You, the audience, have the ability, of course, to post questions using the chat facility, and please do so as we go along, and we'll try to take some of those, otherwise get back to you after the session. So to begin with a very brief and selective recap on where we are and how we got here. Back in June 2016, we had a referendum, and the majority of those who voted to leave the EU. The next year, in March, 30th March 2017, with parliamentary approval, the UK government gave formal notice of its intention to leave the EU. And under Article 50 of the Treaty on the European Union, the UK and the EU then had 2 years, that's until 29th of March 2019, next Friday, to agree the terms of the UK's withdrawal and an outline of their future relationship. After 18 months of negotiations, a draft withdrawal agreement and a political declaration on future relations emerged last November. Together, those constitute the deal, so-called, that the EU is offering the UK. Under the withdrawal agreement, the UK would leave the EU on the 29th of March 2019, but it would be treated for most purposes as if it were still in the EU until the end of 2020, or, if the period is extended, the transition period is extended, 2022. During that transitional implementation period, the EU and the UK would have to negotiate the terms of their future relationship based on the fairly broad outlines contained in the political declaration. So the UK Parliament and the European Parliament must approve the deal before the Article 50 notice period expires, otherwise the UK leaves with no deal. The UK Parliament voted overwhelmingly to reject the deal in January, and then again last week. Also last week, it voted to avoid a no-deal Brexit and to require the government to request the EU for an extension of the Article 50 notice period. Because it's now generally accepted that even if everything goes according to plan, the UK is not and will not be fully prepared for Brexit in legislative terms by the end of next week, even if it's going to leave on a no-deal basis. On the 18th of March, so after this week, the Speaker of the House of Commons, who has wide powers to control what is debated and voted on in Parliament, ruled that the government could not put substantially the same question to Parliament again. In other words, there can't be another vote on the withdrawal agreement deal without something having changed. The government had previously indicated that it was going to seek another vote on the deal, but only if there was reason to believe that it would win. Some, but not all of those who had previously voted against the deal, at least on the government benches, had started to indicate they might be persuaded to change their minds. Now, it remains to be seen how the government will deal with the Speaker's ruling. In the meantime, there's a meeting of EU leaders scheduled for tomorrow, which is meant to be considering how to respond to the latest developments, and in particular to the UK's request, which the Prime Minister has just sent, for an extension of the Article 50 period, which requires all member states to agree to it if it's to take effect. In advance of that, we've had not only the request from Theresa May for an extension, asking for an extension of the Article 50 period to the end of June, but also indications from Brussels that an extension could only go as far as the 23rd of May, or it would have to be a rather longer extension than just a few months. And this is all partly because of the fact that there are European parliamentary elections scheduled, and the thought is that either the UK should have left before those elections take place, therefore not participating in the elections, or it should accept that it's going to have to participate, and there will be a longer extension whilst we work out what to do. So, we are really not clear as to what is about to happen after all this time. But just to begin to explore the current political situation a little bit, Roger, if I can turn to you, why has it taken so long to not approve the deal? And is there any prospect that it will be approved, or are we just going to end up with a no deal exit?
Yeah, thank you, Adam. As to why it's taken so long, I think there's a few things in it. One, the main one is that the government's approach has been perpetually to push down the road the substantive issue of what the UK is looking for out of Brexit. So, having got to the stage of a withdrawal agreement and a political declaration, of course it really has ducked the issue of what sort of Brexit people want. Now that's important because for the keenest of the Brexiteer MPs, leaving the EU very quickly is obviously has an attraction, but only in a way that doesn't tie into the existing arrangements beyond a fixed period. Whereas for those who want to secure an arrangement that maintains some or all of the existing ties, they don't want to leave until they understand what ties are going to be maintained. So we see with the withdrawal agreements two things. The first problem is that it doesn't really address those underlying tensions. It doesn't really address the long-term arrangement or even tell MPs what sort of long-term arrangement is being envisaged. When you look at the political declaration, it says very little about it. It's only aspirational, and it retains a lot of the tensions. But then when you look even at what the withdrawal agreement does achieve, it's got a lot of problems. Now the key problem, of course, has been the focus on the backstop, and that has been a real tension between the different categories of MPs. Now, the tension, I think, can be put into a number of categories. One is that the backstop is there to obviously secure the openness of the border of Northern Ireland, but the way that it's achieved that is by committing the whole of the UK to being tied to what essentially is the customs union in all but name for an indefinite period. Now, this is something that a lot of MPs, particularly on the Brexit side, just simply find unacceptable as a matter of principle, and it's arisen because of the need to keep Northern Ireland within, and MPs finding it unacceptable for different parts of the United Kingdom to be treated differently. The particular reason why they find it unacceptable, other than merely generally a desire to move forward, is one of the opportunities, if you like, that is often cited as a benefit of Brexit, is the ability of the UK to embark on free trade agreements with third countries. Now, you can't embark on free trade agreements with third countries very easily, or at least the scope of what you can do is extremely limited if you're tied to a customs arrangement with the European Union. And that's, I think, the particular sort of focus of why it is that there's a real concern about being tied to this. It's not only merely that it slows down generally the process of leaving the framework of the EU, although there's a certain amount of that in particular, it's that it slows down that very symbolic element of freedom of being able to enter into free trade agreements with third countries. And of course we've seen therefore this rather curious reliance on the details of the legal advice, which has taken on a particular importance, even though the potential variation in the legal advice is not all that great. But what it's really come down to is a question at the moment of whether the assurances that the EU has given as to the temporary nature of the backstop are sufficiently close to being enforceable to give those who are keen to ensure that the temporary arrangements, that the backstop doesn't run on forever, a basis for leaving under a timescale they can understand, and that therefore when they agree to leave, they know that it is going to be at some point that the UK has some control over, leaving in a way that allows the free trade agreements to be entered into.
Thank you very much. Just while you're speaking, I see that we had a statement from Donald Tusk, and he says, a short extension will be possible, conditional on a positive vote on the withdrawal agreement in the Commons. So...
Well, that in itself is fascinating. I mean, it will be very interesting to see how the government responds. I mean, it logically it makes some sense, but it's very difficult to see how that conditionality can be offered with any certainty in the time available.
Okay. Well, I think we're not going to solve the short-term issues here. Let's start to look a bit further beyond. I mean, suppose there is no majority for the deal before the end of the Article 50 deadline, whenever that is, and there's no other solution is found. We end up leaving the EU with no deal. We've got used to this talk of crashing out of the EU. What does that mean in practice? And has any sort of greater clarity emerged over the last few weeks as to how trade between the EU and the UK on the one hand, and that the UK and the rest of the world would work in no deal scenario? I know there's been various attempts to sort of patch together bits and pieces to make that work.
Yeah, I think there's two things. And in terms of identifying the issues, I think that there has been quite a bit of work done in recent months. The UK government has been developing since last summer a series of notices breaking down in some detail, they're not fantastically detailed, but breaking down what the issues are. It's prepared a pack to guide traders as to what are the key issues that they need to identify. So it's certainly true that there has been some work done to develop what the issues are. And that's rather different to saying that it's really come up with solutions for them. It's certainly come up with some fixes for some areas. The transitional simplified procedure for goods is an example. Postponed VAT is another one to address some of the issues. But what it's really done its work on is identifying issues so that businesses know what to expect, rather than necessarily providing solutions for them. So I think certainly in terms of the impacts we will see issues at borders. There will certainly be delays. Inevitably, of course, there will be tariffs. And none of those, those are simply things that you can identify, but there's only a certain amount that can be done about them. So what the impacts are will vary from one to another, from one sector to another, and from one business to another. But they have been identified in a fair degree of depth, I think, over the last few months.
Yes. And the UK, of course, has published some proposed tariffs that would apply. Which,
yes. Yes, those tariffs it's published a temporary schedule of tariffs. It's notable that for a large number of categories of goods, the tariff will be zero on a temporary basis. And that, of course, is intended to ensure that trade between the EU and the UK that has previously been tariff-free is, to the greatest extent possible, still tariff-free. But the fact of it being temporary is important because it doesn't therefore preclude or give rise to problems when the UK perhaps comes up with a more permanent schedule in the longer term that maybe will have higher tariffs for some of those goods. So I don't think it should be treated as anything more than a temporary carryover. It shouldn't indicate what the long-term arrangements will be.
But the basic story is that we, again, as people have got very used to saying, without perhaps thinking about what it means, that we fall back on WTO terms, except where we've got some replacement deal with other countries.
Yes, we do fall back on WTO terms, and that will create, a range of issues of different sorts for different businesses. And I think in very broad terms, if you are a trader in goods or if you rely on the supply of goods, the categories of issue will be delays at the border, tariffs, import, VAT, those sorts of issues. If you are a provider of or a relier on services, the questions will be more about the ability to move people, the recognition of qualifications, and the ability to provide the services across the board. Those sorts of issues. So the way they arise will be different for different people, for different businesses. I think the key practical things businesses can really do at the moment is know what to anticipate.
But we have got some replacement deals.
Well, we have a small number of replacement deals. The government has been pleased to announce that it has secured arrangements with Chile, with Switzerland, with the Faroe Islands, and with a handful of others for deals which will enable them to carry on business on broadly the same terms as the UK was able to do business with those countries as a member state. But that really highlights the other category of problem, that of course when we leave the EU it's not only an issue of trade between the UK and the EU, there are the other approximately 55 countries, I think it is, which currently benefit from a free trade deal with the EU, and the UK as an EU member has of course been benefiting from those. And those members, or most of those members, have not yet agreed that they would roll over the current terms of the EU in a no-deal scenario. So, for example, there are goods being shipped already from the UK to Japan. I take that as an example because it's far away and the shipping takes some time. Goods being shipped today from the UK to Japan may well not arrive until after the 29th of March. And of course, therefore, we don't know, and nor does the exporter from the UK know, whether the UK will still be able to benefit from a free trade agreement with Japan when those goods arrive in Japan. And so that is already causing a problem for traders between the UK and some of the other countries with whom the EU, and therefore at the moment the UK, benefits from a free trade arrangement.
Okay, thanks very much. If we could turn briefly to another aspect of the UK government's preparations for Brexit, one area where there's a significant gap to fill is in relation to immigration policy. It's clear that concerns about immigration from the EU into the UK were a factor in the referendum vote, but it's taken the government some time to outline how the immigration rules will change after Brexit. And of course, many businesses rely as much on the mobility of labour as they do on the movement of goods. Jessica, if I could turn to you, are businesses ready for the impact that Brexit could have on the deployment of EU nationals in the UK and UK nationals in the EU? And is the government ready to implement its post-Brexit immigration policy?
I think that business in the UK have been waiting patiently, or some others probably impatiently, to know what type of Brexit we're going to be dealing with, because the impact will be different. I think that business is comfortable, and most EU nationals already living in the UK are comfortable that they know they'll be able to stay. There is a process to follow that actually has been open since the end of last year, and is working reasonably well. So, for EU nationals already here, we know they can stay. If we are looking at a no-deal scenario, then there will be some transitional arrangements in place to allow EU nationals to continue coming to the UK. They won't require employer sponsorship, so it will be a fairly open system. But the visa conditions under which they will be subject to are far less than what they would have had under freedom of movement. And when you have EU nationals having a choice of countries where they can work, whether that's in sort of lower skilled roles or highly skilled roles, coming to the UK and being subject to immigration control is not going to be particularly beneficial. While there are transitional arrangements in place to allow that movement of people from Europe to the UK to continue, it remains to be seen how attractive that is going to be. I think the more pressing issue for businesses in the UK at the moment is the ability of UK nationals to be able to work in Europe. There are many UK businesses, particularly in the services industry, that rely on being able to send UK nationals at short notice to work in the EU, whether that's on a sort of project basis for a month at a time, or a sort of more regular 3 days a week for a continuing period. Now, not knowing whether we're going to be having a deal or not, and whether there's going to be a transition period, these businesses who rely on sending UK nationals to Europe are now sort of thinking, well, these UK nationals are going to be subject to an immigration regime in these countries. I've not had to deal with that before. It's not possible to get visas overnight. How is my business model going to change if I can't send a UK national to work in Germany at a day's notice? And I think that is causing a lot of anxiety and concern. So, certainly having a transition period to the end of 2020 would allow businesses to change, how they approach these situations. We also know that from 2021, we will have a new immigration regime in the UK. Where it will be essentially meeting in the middle somewhere between freedom of movement and the current sort of work permit regime we have. The new immigration regime will be applicable to all to all nationalities. There will be no preferential treatment for EU nationals, and the benefit of not having freedom of movement on immigration policy is that we can lower some of the thresholds for people to qualify for work permits, known as Tier 2 visas in the UK. So from 2021, the UK should have a relatively open, liberal immigration system for employer-sponsored visas, but we just have to get through the next couple of years first.
Great, thanks very much. Let's widen the discussion a bit now. Unless Brexit doesn't happen at all, the UK is likely to go on to prioritise the agreement of a new trading relationship with the EU and new trade arrangements with other significant trade partners like the US and Canada. And all that will have to be negotiated either against the background of the withdrawal agreement, where the UK is transitioning from its current EU-based arrangements, or in a no-deal scenario where the sort of status quo is trade on WTO terms. At various stages, pro-Brexit politicians have suggested that it would be very easy for the UK to do all this, because with the countries where there's an existing EU trade agreement, it can just roll over the terms of the existing deal, and with other countries, it'll be able to reach agreement quicker because there's only one of us, rather than having to deal with the preferences of another 27 EU member states. So perhaps, Gordon, if I could turn to you at this point. Obviously, for any post-Brexit administration in the UK, a trade deal with the US would be the ultimate prize, particularly given the absence of a comprehensive US-EU free trade agreement. Unfortunately, in most UK media, the prospect of a deal with the US tends simply to be discussed in terms of either we're going to all be forced to eat chlorinated chicken, or the National Health Service is going to be privatized by evil American corporations. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than those kind of easy scare stories. So perhaps if I could begin by asking you, how would you expect the US government to approach trade negotiations with the UK?
Well, thank you. Actually, until the Brexit debate, I didn't realize that we had chlorinated chicken in the United States. So I haven't quite figured out what that is, but I have noticed that people in Britain apparently don't care for it. In my part of the United States, we just have deep fat fried chicken, which is probably less healthy than chlorinated chicken, but it's quite delicious. So I think, frankly, and you wouldn't be surprised that on the other side of the pond I'd have this view, that if there actually is a hard or relatively hard Brexit that ultimately develops, that the opportunity for trade with the United States and, for that matter, with North America is pretty significant, and that the potential for that is, I think, better than average, that the United States would turn its attention once the negotiations with China are concluded, and most feel like that is going to reach a resting place sometime in April, culminating with a meeting with our president and the Chinese president in Florida. So I think there's a real opening for that kind of certainly a bilateral negotiation, but and I'll be interested in what Paul's view of this is, but I'd think bigger than that. I'd think of it wouldn't necessarily literally be accession to the new North American Free Trade Agreement, but in some ways making it an agreement with North America, which I haven't looked at the statistics currently, this month, but I think North America's economy is equal to or greater than continental Europe. So whether if the UK was doing a more active, more open trade relationship with the United States, and all of North America wouldn't be a net economic plus. I'm not suggesting you ought to trade one for the other, but I think there's a real opportunity there. And I think the politics in the United States would facilitate it, because I think the current administration would like to demonstrate that they can step in where Europe may have dropped the ball, just as a geopolitical matter. So I think there's a lot of potential there, and I promise we will not try and export our healthcare system to the UK. We barely can figure out how to run it ourselves, so we're not going to push it on you.
Yeah. I mean, are your kind of US private sector clients showing an interest in how they might approach a deal with the UK?
Yes, a number, not just our clients, but I've been to a number of trade programs recently where particularly large international companies based in the U.S. See opportunity, perhaps, from a new North American or U.S.-UK agreement. So there's some anticipation that however Brexit plays out, unless you ultimately somehow drop back and just maintain the status quo, which from afar seems unlikely. I think in whatever terms Brexit is likely to play out, that there's viewed to be some real opportunity on this side of the pond, as I say. And of course, Paul's got the perspective from Canada, where there's a Canada EU agreement in place. Obviously, the U.S. doesn't have that. My theory is that we should start a dialogue in some way, not starting with an EU agreement, but and Mexico obviously has one as well, but to try and have a somewhat unique relationship created between the UK and North America.
But I guess if we were negotiating with in that terms with the whole of North America, we would have to be careful. I mean, what would be the advice to UK businesses which perhaps aren't so used to getting themselves actively involved in their government engaging in trade negotiations, because they haven't had to. It's been done with the EU for a while. How should UK businesses approach the prospect of that potentially rather large negotiation?
Well, my view of that's pretty straightforward. They all ought to engage a global law firm that has talented trade professionals in all of those jurisdictions for advice. And I've got one in mind, but I'm being a little flippant, but I do think that there are some novel challenges for both the UK government and UK-based commercial enterprises, because you really haven't had active engagement in trade negotiations in some time, and for better or for worse, Canada, Mexico, the United States, not just among our three countries, but with others, have been pretty active over the last period of years, and we've got a lot of trade professionals in our respective capitals, both in and out of government. So I think the private sector in the UK will have to provide a lot of assistance in the thinking and structuring of a potential deal across the Atlantic.
Yeah, could I just exactly to endorse Gordon's point? I think one thing that it's useful to flag for businesses and trade industry bodies in the UK is one thing they could be doing now, as well as thinking, identifying the issues that might come out of a Brexit, be it a no deal Brexit or otherwise, and anticipating those and taking steps within their business model to deal with that. At the same time, they should be beginning to have in mind, what arrangements or what provisions would they like to see in a future trade agreement between the UK and the EU, or between the UK and any of the other countries that are likely to be top targets. And that's some work that, firstly, I think every business should be starting to think about, and every sector should be starting to think about. And some have done. I think there were some that perhaps rather optimistically were thinking about this very early on, thinking that the process might move rather quicker. But that there has been some interest early on, and that has been rather put on hold, I think, because the more immediate developments of Brexit have got in the way a little bit. But it's certainly something that businesses could usefully be turning their mind to. What would they like to see the UK negotiate for, and then they can, having identified that internally, help the UK government by taking those points to the government to assist it in pushing for something that will assist UK businesses.
Good, thanks. Okay, so Paul, turning to you. Canada is, as Gordon mentioned, in the happy position of having recently concluded a wide-ranging trade deal with the EU known as CETA. And the EU has said that, at least if in the world where we stick to the kind of red lines that have been applied by the UK government so far, in a sense the best that the UK can hope for in reaching a post-Brexit free trade arrangement with the EU is something that looks a bit like CETA. I was just wondering if the UK could agree a CETA-style agreement with the EU unrealistically tomorrow, what kind of benefits would the UK and, for that matter, EU businesses be missing out on compared with what they get under the EU rules?
Sure. Well, first, thanks, and it's a pleasure and a privilege again to be participating in one of these Brexit panels with such distinguished and brilliant colleagues from a number of different time zones. To answer your question, look, it's very important to understand the fundamental difference between a customs union and a free trade agreement. In the customs union universe, the one that you're in right now with the EU, goods move freely across the borders of the member countries without border inspection or customs formalities happening at the time of entry. Importantly as well, there's no need to prove the origin of the goods as being made or manufactured or originating in the region. Once they're in the region, they can move around freely. In a free trade area, that's not the case. The border formalities very much remain in place. Every shipment has to be customs cleared, and to benefit from the favorable treatment under the free trade agreement, the importer has to be able to demonstrate, to prove the origin of the goods, which usually means a fairly heavy administrative and record-keeping burden imposed on the importer to be able to provide that demonstration when asked by the customs authorities. In complex manufactured goods, proving origin within the free trade area can be a pretty complex task. Another important distinction, it was touched upon earlier, is on labor mobility. The CETA, for example, between Canada and the EU has some good and favorable measures on labor mobility, providing better access for businesses to send its employees on a temporary basis to the EU and vice versa, EU companies to Canada. But that's a very far cry from the full labor mobility that you enjoy in the EU context. Another important distinction, I think, for the UK is the kinds of integration at the financial services level. There is a financial services chapter in the CETA, but it's a very far cry from the very intense level of integration you have in financial services and the very free movement of financial services, the free provision of financial services across the borders within the EU. You won't have that under a CETA-style agreement between the UK and the EU. Finally, it's also important to understand that free trade's not really free. It's free-ish. It's enhanced trade. It's duty-free trade on many products, but a lot of protections and local preferences do remain. It's the game of the exceptions in free trade agreements, and that typically includes many food products, textiles and apparel, and many other products that continue to be tagged with significant duties. And the other important difference is that in the context of free trade agreements versus customs union, the whole world of trade remedies, anti-dumping and countervail, safeguards remedies, and so on, can be imposed on goods. There are a very few rare breed of free trade agreements where the free trade parties have agreed to disarm anti-dumping and countervail remedies as between the signatory parties, but that's very much the exception, and that is not what we did in the CETA. So that is another significant barrier that can cause a lot of risk to importers and exporters that exist in the CETA-style free trade agreement and not in a customs union. So it's a different world. It's a big climb down in terms of the benefits for companies, the CETA-style free trade agreement versus a customs union, and I hope that gives you a thumbnail sketch of
that's really helpful. But I mean, having said all the things that it doesn't do, I mean, CETA is still quite long. It took quite a long time to agree it.
Yes. I mean, when Canadians started seeing a lot of the declarations in the media from UK politicians about how the UK was going to enter into free trade agreements around the world with a large number of parties, and there were some pretty extreme declarations about, the day we leave the EU, we'll have in place, X number of free trade agreements. Canadians were pretty skeptical when they saw that sort of thing, because we have a long track record of negotiating a lot of free trade agreements, and certainly the CETA took a prodigiously long time and required a lot of patience to get concluded. I mean, just to give you a sense of that, the negotiations were officially launched in 2000. Preliminary stages of the negotiations, I should say, were officially launched in 2007. The first round of negotiations happened in 2009, and the agreement provisionally came into force in September 2017. And some measures still aren't fully implemented. So roughly 10 years from a standing start is what it took to finally conclude the CETA. Negotiations of free trade agreements between G8 economies, between large, complex, sophisticated, developed economies, is complicated. Modern free trade agreements cover a huge cross-section of issues, all of which require careful consideration and consensus building within country, and we've learned how to do this in Canada pretty effectively over the course of many negotiations. But they ultimately require a lot of work within the country to arrive at negotiating positions and then to accept concessions when they need to be made. All of that takes time. And, over the course of these things, governments change, policies change, public sentiment can change. All of this is dynamic and evolving and can derail or at least slow down negotiations quite a bit. So you have to start free trade negotiations from a stance of patience and properly calibrated expectations in terms of how long it's going to take. And it appeared to us from Canada, and looking at some of the declarations, that perhaps there was an undue degree of optimism about how quickly the UK was going to be able to negotiate agreements.
So we couldn't just start by taking CETA and doing a bit of cut and paste as a first draft for a UK-Canada agreement.
Well, look, the CETA is definitely the template, and will be the starting point for any discussions between Canada and the UK, naturally. It's a great help to have that agreement to start with, but and in fact, there is some talk already that's circulating in specialized media circles here and so on, and business media here, about Canada and the UK, at least on merchandise trade, the tariffs that apply to merchandise, to have some form of standstill agreement. So to just leave in place, as between Canada and the UK, what's in the CETA. It gets quite complicated when you talk about particular areas where we negotiated specific concessions, for example, on dairy products. The EU was provided with an enhanced volume quota for cheese, for example. That quota was granted to the EU, not on a country-by-country basis within the EU. Do we grant some sort of pro rata to the UK and carve out of the EU quota that part? That would be problematic in terms of our compliance with the CETA, and Brussels would certainly stamp its feet about it. So in a lot of regards, it becomes quite complicated to just, take the CETA and extend it to the UK. But at least on merchandise trade, to try to reduce supply chain disruptions as much as possible, there is talk of trying to provide the same tariff treatment to the UK that we do for the CETA countries, at least on a temporary basis. And in terms of other agreements that the parties would look at, there's a lot to go around. There's the CPTPP, which was recently signed as well. There's the new NAFTA. Tying back to the discussion that you had with Gordon about, a North American continental approach to trade with the UK, that's not something that's discussed in Canada very much. And frankly, I'm not sure that Canadian negotiators and policymakers would view it necessarily in our interests to pursue that. I think if that moves ahead, Canada will be participating in that in a bit more of a defensive stance than leader of the pack, because we see ourselves as being in the enviable position of being able to sell Canada to European investors as a great platform to do business throughout North America. And in the unique position of having the free trade agreement with Europe and a free trade agreement with the US, and therefore being a great place to be the hub to those spokes. We lose that a little bit when if there's a free trade agreement between the U.S. and Europe, or between the U.S. and the U.K., maybe then the U.K. becomes a good hub to do business across the North American continent, and we lose kind of that edge to a certain degree. So I'm not sure that Canada has perhaps as much appetite for the concept of a North American deal with the U.K. that others might have, but I'm not in the boardroom with the negotiators, and I think it's probably premature. I think we're going to see where the dust settles on Brexit at the end of March first before we start taking firm negotiating stances on that sort of thing.
Sure. But I just wonder, perhaps finally, if you compare, we're presumably going to be entering into these negotiations with, Canada, the EU, whoever, either in a world where we're in no deal with the EU, or where we've got the sort of protection that comes with the transitional arrangements and the withdrawal agreement, and we hope that includes continuation of the relevant EU agreements with third countries. How would you characterise the difference from the UK point of view, between being in those two situations and trying to enter into these negotiations?
Well, look, if the EU, if the UK has concluded some sort of firm and stable free trade agreement of some sort with the EU post-Brexit, it has a lot more to sell in negotiations with third countries than if it doesn't have, if all it has is WTO access to Europe. It has less to sell in the context of negotiations with third countries. It has less appeal to offer to investors in that country, and so to me, the priority for the UK is to sort out a relationship that makes sense and that's preferential with the EU. As a matter of priority, most of your trade by far is with the EU. You have to get that sorted out and stabilized, and for people to understand that there's long-term stability there and that they understand what the rules are. To my mind, before you do much in terms of formalized free trade agreements with other significant economies that are important to the UK. I think you have more leverage, you have more to sell if that's sorted out first, and you're likely going to get better deals from those trading partners than you otherwise will. Does that answer it for you?
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. If Nadia, if I could turn finally to you for a kind of litigator's view on what happens when things go wrong. Clearly, a lot of UK businesses currently only trade with the EU, and a lot of EU businesses trade a lot with the UK, and they enjoy the benefits of EU membership as they do that. Any new UK-EU free trade agreement is going to be a different kind of arrangement, and it will give those businesses a different set of rights and different ways to enforce them. What kind of differences do you think businesses will notice in that situation, and how can they prepare for that new world, assuming we're even lucky enough to get to it?
So if we are speaking about potentially a new free trade agreement, a lot will depend on the scope of the market access that will be permitted and agreed upon by the parties for goods and for services and for non-tariff barriers that may be in place. I think you will need to pretty much improvise on the go. Once the government will be engaged in extensive negotiations of the free trade agreement, the business circles need to participate actively with the government, engage and be in the loop of the proposed items on the agenda of the negotiations as they unravel, in order to be able to impact while the negotiations are still happening on the outcome of these negotiations and market access commitments undertaken by the parties. If we have, unfortunately, a no-deal Brexit, the difficulties will be in that market access commitments under WTO, as Paul has mentioned. They're obviously not as attractive as what the UK enjoys currently. There are rules. The rules in the WTO govern access to the market for goods, access to the market for services, and also trade in intellectual property. And these trade regimes are all subject to 4 basic requirements of the WTO law. The first 2 requirements concern non-discrimination provisions, where with respect to import into the UK would not be able to discriminate between different WTO members, so between the European Union imports and imports from, say, Egypt. It would need to treat both imports equally. The UK will also not be able to discriminate once the goods from these countries are imported into the UK, discriminate these imports against the treatment enjoyed by purely UK goods within the UK territory. Third principle is obviously the prohibition of quantitative restrictions, so you would not be able to limit influx of goods and apply quotas to any one of the goods. This is a third principle, fundamental principle of trade in the WTO. And the fourth is you would be bound by your tariff bindings and concessions that you will have confirmed with the WTO members for goods and services. Luckily, you will enjoy access to certain derogations and exceptions from the WTO rules. So you will be able to apply anti-dumping duties when it comes to that, and you'll have time to launch the investigation. You'll be able to apply safeguard measures, and my hunch is that you will see a lot of safeguard measures happening in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit, because European Union is a notorious user of trade remedies, so it imposes many anti-dumping measures. Countervailing measures on imports from China are commonplace in the EU. And so if there is a hard Brexit and UK will no longer apply anti-dumping duties that the EU would have adopted prior to Brexit, you will have a void, you will have basically an empty possibility, a room for imports from China to flood the UK market with no anti-dumping duties in place. So the UK will need to immediately react and potentially impose safeguard measures to protect domestic industry from such imports. And an interesting one that I thought of yesterday after the presentation, after our initial webinar, was one interesting element that you may enjoy is access to the agricultural agreement, because the WTO rules divide the world of goods into industrial goods, so merchandise, as Paul Lalonde refers to them, and agricultural goods. And for agricultural goods, WTO members are allowed to maintain subsidies. They call them aggregate measures of support. So UK will now be entitled to 5% of its annual agricultural GDP in subsidies to be provided to domestic industry. When it was part of the EU, these subsidies were calculated and regulated by Brussels, and so each one was allocated a sort of level of these subsidies domestically. But now the UK will be able to enjoy its own determination with respect to, what are the subsidies that and which aspects of economy they want to give agricultural subsidies to, and provided they adhere to all of the notifications and procedural requirements of the WTO, it should be able to fly in the environment of new WTO reality after hard Brexit.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, so maybe some upside for some farmers somewhere then. I think we've pretty much come to the end of the time allotted for this session. So I'd like to thank very much everyone who's participated in it: Roger, Jessica, Gordon, Paul, and Nadia for their time and insights. If anyone listening got any questions coming out of this session or Brexit more generally, do please feel free to contact any of us or your usual Denton's contacts, or indeed Damien Taylor, our Director of BD, whose details are on the Denton's Brexit site. We will be holding further sessions over the coming weeks, and we hope you can join us for those as they're scheduled. But for now, good afternoon. Thanks very much.